You're listening to Ecto Portal, a journey into the unknown with Anthony Anderson and VERNA Wilson.
I hope that you are seated comfortably, with the light turned down and the curtains drawn.
Somebody there?
Hello, welcome back to the Ecto Portal. I'm Anthony Anderson, your host, and I'm with my co-host,
VERNA Wilson. Nice to be here. Our guest is Glenn Steckling, who runs the George Adamski Foundation.
And what is your interest in, and how did you first hear about George Adamski?
Well, my interest was I was at the bookstore and I was looking through. I was just bored, and I was looking through some books on UFOs. They had it in the metaphysical section, even though I don't really consider UFOs a metaphysical subject. Mm-hmm. And I was just looking at a book on contactees, and I happened to run across George Adamski, and I started reading a little bit about his story. There was only a picture and a paragraph, so I thought, I thought his story sounds the most authentic and most interesting out of most of the ones I've read, even though there was some other interesting ones that I read as well. So I decided to go ahead and research him, and I ordered some books from the foundation, and I just started reading them.
When was this, when you first got into it?
Pardon me?
Do you know what year it was when you first got into it?
When I first got into it? Yeah, 1996.
Okay.
Yeah. I just started reading stuff, and I started ordering stuff from ordering books from the foundation, and I started reading extensively about his experiences, and interest. And then from there, I tried to research and learn more.
Nice.
Yeah.
What about you? Similar?
I heard of George Adamski for a long time because I've always been into UFOs and stuff like that since I was a teenager. And I heard of George Adamski. I read his book a long time ago, and when Verna had that book, and I go, wait a second, I didn't know this book, Now I had to reread it again over the weekend because there's just a lot of things that, that I didn't recognize or I didn't pay attention as well as I do now. And I'm always been interested by him. Also, Billy Meyer.
Yeah, I used to have a laser disc they put out in the 90s of all of his films that he shot of UFOs.
Oh, yeah.
And I had it for the longest time, and it was odd to me. I don't know that I completely believe that it was real, because they all look like they could have been small little aircrafts that he built and just sort of shot for perspective. And I don't know.
Him and or like Billy Myers, that he's also.
That's what I'm talking about, Billy Myers.
Oh, Billy Myers, yeah. And then there's been several other people over times that they have pictures of a spaceman and stuff like that. But I've always been very interested in that. We talked about.
Have you seen those videos of his though?
Oh yeah, I have.
Yeah, it's too bad I bought the Laserdisc literally for $2.99 as a cutout. And guess how much it goes for now?
How much?
$700.
I believe it.
I wish I hadn't sold it or gave it away. I don't know where it is.
There's a lot of Billy Meyer haters out there, and they.
I'm not a hater. I just don't have enough to go on.
I know you're not a hater, but I'm just saying there's a lot of.
I myself, I'm a little skeptical on Billy's story, but that's just me. But That's just
Well, it
me.
was way out in Sweden. He was just a farmer,
I think it was
just doing his
Switzerland,
thing.
actually.
Oh, Switzerland. I'm
yeah,
sorry.
Switzerland. Yeah.
Yeah, and
But look
you
at
know.
crop circles. I mean, who's to say what's real and what ones aren't? I mean, it's hard to say.
Right.
Unless you have absolute personal proof, I think someone's always going to be skeptical about all of it.
Although you have to
of
admit the
course.
crop circle designs are fantastic.
They're beautiful.
and-
I wish
yeah,
I
they're very
could
beautiful.
design them.
Yeah. I mean, they're nice. Yeah, they're very
But they're
beautiful.
huge.
See some
They're
great
huge,
t-shirts
and
there.
they're huge.
And the fact that they're done all in one night, it makes you wonder, what's
Also,
yeah.
my sister introduced me to Frank Strange. Remember him?
Frank
Yes,
Strange. I
Frank
haven't heard of
Strange
Frank
is, yeah.
Strange.
I'm skeptical about him too. I
Yeah.
don't, yeah.
Are you? What about now? Did you guys read any Whitley Strieber books in the 90s?
Whitley
Comedian.
Strieber, I
I read
believe
a
him
couple
more.
things.
Yeah.
I read one or two, and then I got tired of it because he really, and I guess he's had multiple experiences, but the first book was pretty good, Communion, and then I think it was
Yeah, Communion is really good.
there was another. I don't remember the second one after that, but I read it, and then after a while, I'm like, it just makes me wonder: is this after the third or fourth book? Are you just musing on something you've already written about? Which is possible. If you're continuing having experiences, I guess you would still have more to write about. But
See, but that's what bothers me.
fascinated by it.
That sometimes when people say they have experiences and, over and over again, and they're moved, and they've gone off to do something else in their life besides just to get away from that place where they got abducted in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
How do the aliens know that, or not unless they put a device on him? Those
Well,
little
they
we
say
were
they're
talking about.
tagged. They say
they're
they're tagged by
and
mother
they know where
and
they
usually
is.
children.
But how about the neighborhood? Nobody's seen anything. They don't see some strange light or seeing them come through a wall or
You know
through
what
the
my
roof or,
theory is?
You know,
My theory is, and this leads to paranormal again,
Yeah.
is you're physically not going anywhere. Your mind,
I
your
see.
mental state when you're asleep, that can leave. It's like out of the body experience. Let me finish.
I will.
And I think
definitely.
the aliens, whoever, they do have contact with you. They come to you. They can remove you from that safely, take you somewhere else.
It makes sense.
And
yeah.
maybe you think you see your body or you're experiencing everything still.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And you go back into your body and you have all these amazing experiences like, well, I was taken up and I
Right.
went through the wall. My body must have gone through the wall
Right,
and I was taken into
right.
the craft. Well, maybe the whole time your body was numb, lifeless, not dead,
Right.
just sort of suspended in animation
Right.
in your bed while you're taken off.
Very interesting theory. Yeah.
They examine it because people often claim they see themselves when they come back. They have experiences
like a body
that would
body,
explain
body out experience.
life after
Yeah.
death when you
That-
can
that
see
would
your body
explain
and you
it,
go
yeah.
back. Maybe someone said, no, you're going back.
Or it could be like elusive dreaming.
I think that's all
Could be,
connected
yeah.
somehow, but we don't know why.
We don't know why. What I was about to say, what I was about to say when you were done was that the only account that not the only. I mean, George's account was physical. There was no way he was in the dream state or his body was
Yeah,
suspended
he kept
or whatever.
telling himself, my God, this is really happening.
Yeah,
Right.
But also a later, more contemporary account where he claimed it was a physical experience was Travis Walton.
Yeah.
The one who
Yep.
did the book Fire in the Sky.
Right.
He claimed it was a more physical experience, and he's one of the few that was not in the dream or suspended state.
Travis Walton, he's the guy who was with the other guys in
Yeah.
the truck
Right.
that got abducted.
That
The
got
loggers,
abducted.
yeah.
Yeah,
the
with that,
loggers,
you know
yeah.
what? Those guys took a lie detector test over and over
Mm-hmm.
again. And they said, no, these guys were not lying. It really did happen to them. They were abducted.
And they're not the kind of guys that would, I don't think,
They were
make up a
just
story
good old
anyway.
boys just going home from work, you know?
Exactly.
And
just
it
going home from
happens,
work,
you know?
yeah, and he-
yeah.
But he has very vivid descriptions in his book of what happened.
Extremely. And,
I mean,
Whitley
and
Strieber
Barney
does too,
and
but-
that other case, the married couple, Barney and Betty
Hill.
Hill.
Yeah, Barney and Betty
case.
Hill.
But
Yeah, I
look
read
at-
about
look at
that.
Also
Travis-
another fantastic
Look at
story.
Travis Walton, though. When it happened to him,
right.
his friends took off in the truck and left him.
Right.
He was found, was it a week later?
A week later on the ground, yeah.
Naked.
But think about it. Again, maybe he was in the forest, not moving somewhere, but he was taken, but his body wasn't.
Well, I mean, what
We don't
happened?
know.
I mean, well, he.
Again,
I mean,
this is
he found
going off my
himself in
theory
a.
of what
he
if.
found himself waking up not
But
in
what
the
I'm
forest, but
saying
in a
is-
town.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean, who knows? Maybe they did take him. Maybe they do both. Maybe they take him and they take your life essence at the same time. And
Right.
different, there may be different levels of taking.
Well, that's true. I mean, yeah.
Because women, they say they're pregnant for no reason, and then
Right.
the pregnancy disappears. It's not a miscarriage.
Yeah.
Physical. Other points, maybe they're sampling when they take you out and they put you back. But
That's a whole nother subject, a whole nother genre of of another side of the UFO thing.
Well, there was actually a panel of UFO abductees once at the Whole Life Expo, and one woman claimed that she was pregnant and that something, I forgot what her whole story was, but she had that claim as well.
Right.
And she said that the doctor didn't understand what was happening to her or why she was having these symptoms. And
the doctors actually make
Yeah.
up excuses like, oh, well, it's just a psychosis. You're thinking you're pregnant, but you're
Yeah.
not.
right.
Because clearly there is no baby. It's gone now. So it
Yeah.
never was really there.
You wanted to be pregnant.
yeah,
You were,
exactly.
yeah.
exactly.
You would
You made that up. You
Right,
know.
and a couple, actually one guy shouted that when she was saying, I don't understand what happened and what I went through, and then this one guy in the audience, he actually stood up and shouted, that's your fault, and we looked at him like, geez, how could that be her fault? It was
Seriously.
crazy.
No.
But actually, I wouldn't mind having Travis Walton on the show one of these days. I'd
I
love
would
to hear
love
his
to
account.
have. I would love to have.
Yeah,
Yeah, that would be
Yeah,
great.
if he's doing interviews,
Yep, yeah.
Yeah, I think
Travis,
that's
if
a
you're
good
listening to
subject for you
this-
guys to get into.
Travis, if you're listening to this, we'd love to have you on the show.
We'll keep trying, Travis.
Yeah, we'll keep trying to get a hold of
He
you.
travels a lot. All over the
Yeah.
Oh, I'm
world.
sure he
I'm sure he
does.
does.
I actually, I'd like it if he can be on the show.
I'd
but-
like Whitley
yeah.
Strieber just to talk to
Heck
him for a
yeah.
while.
Whitley
I
Strieber
should-
would be
I
great to
should
be
try
on the
and-
show.
yeah.
Whitley, if you're listening to this,
Whitley Strieber, if you're
please,
listening.
we'd like you on the show.
Heck, even Christopher Walken, who played Whitley Strieber, if you're listening to
yes.
And now we have a special guest.
Glenn Steckling.
Glenn, are
From
you
the-
there?
Yeah, I'm here.
All right. Welcome to Ecto Portal.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you both.
So, Glenn, we want to begin by talking about your work with the George Adamski Foundation. Tell us a little bit about the history of George and the history of the foundation and how he came to actually be a spokesperson for people from other worlds and what he witnessed.
Well, George had a very long history in this field. Already in the 20s and 30s, he was talking about the universality of life. He was intensely interested in watching the stars. He got his first telescope around 1938 and was given to him as a gift, and he was already watching the night skies then, taking photographs, took some early photographs and turned them into the government, but there was really no response around 38 and 40. Pretty soon we got into World War II. And then George and a group of his students moved out of the Los Angeles base in Laguna Beach, and they moved up towards Valley Center, which is south towards San Diego, and then eventually at the base of Mount Palomar.
Mm-hmm.
And George was exceedingly well known for his clear, accurate telescopic pictures of extraterrestrial spacecraft that had been described all over the world. George was by no means the only person to have taken photographs of them and experienced them, but he had taken some very good pictures. And people always ask, well, some complain they're too clear, not fuzzy enough, and then if some of them are fuzzy, then they're fuzzy and not clear enough. And in George's case, he took nearly dozens of shots, just like anybody else in the old days when you had old cameras with regular old film, and in his case, they were glass plates even. you took a number of photographs, and you bracketed the f-stops and the apertures and everything like that in order to get a high-quality photo you were hoping for. And so he got several of them, and he gave them to the Point Loma Naval Installation, amongst other military personnel, and offered these photographs for them to look and see. And several of these representatives came up to visit him and see the facility and see the negatives and what have you. So George was one of the early contactees, one who came out and straightforward with the type of evidence he had acquired. And that eventually led to a contact out in the desert November 20th of 1952, and there were 6 other witnesses, in which they drove out in the desert and parked, and they saw a large cigar-shaped craft and noticed a small scout-shaped or bell-shaped craft descending into the desert. So George went and walked up there, and eventually, from behind the knoll where the craft landed, out came a gentleman, in which they conversed in the sand, drawing pictures of the solar system, things like that, to indicate where they were from and what have you. The interesting part about all of that is, in Project Blue Book, there is a report of a military aircraft on maneuvers out of the Salton Sea toward Desert Center that reported at the same time and same location witnessing an unidentified flying object. So there was collaboration from that standpoint. And so George's interactions became more frequent. These craft flew over the property at the base of Mount Palomar. A number of people witnessed them. Half a dozen or more witnessed one of them touch down on the property in 1957. And so George went out with his films and his photos, and he went to wherever the people were interested to hear, and that included a world tour in 1959 and another lecture tour in 1963 in Europe. And he went before military personnel, scientists, anybody who was interested, and he was not biased or discriminatory upon whom he gave that information to. And I might add that after George passed away and bequeathed the program to my father was invited to go to NASA before 22 scientists in 1967. My mother went along, and Mrs. Rodover. And then later on to the Pentagon, Colonel Freeman, who had been part of the 1950s investigation. And as I showed in the new book, Behind the Flying Saucer Mystery 2, in which we added 55 new pages of supporting evidence and facts and references, that Freeman said that they were some of the best films that he ever witnessed in civilian hands. So while you see a great deal of derogatory remarks and opinionated accusations about George, nobody has ever stepped forward from the analytical point, all the film analysis, the negative analysis, the film analysis, the biometric radiation, codec optics, so on and so forth. Not just one, not just two, but all of them supported George Adamski's photographs and films. And that has really stuck in the craw and annoyed his skeptics and accusers for decades and decades. And in fact, if you go out into the public arena now, and many of the conferences and many of the media events, they try desperately to ignore George Adamski. In fact, some of them are not even willing to, and I volunteered to offer the film here. Here you go on DVD, you can show it, and let people see for themselves, and they're not interested. So for a person who is long dead since 1965, he's the only one in this field of all the people who have come and gone that still garners such vicious attacks. And the old saying comes to mind, those who protest too much, you know.
You know, it's interesting reading the first book, just his narrative, how open and honest he is and trusting of people. Even when he was showing his photographs and stuff to just anybody he ran into, he was very trusting and, you know,
he
very
was
interested.
very open and very, he seemed very open and very trusting, and he seemed like he had a lot of goodwill that people would do eventually the right thing because he was getting the real deal.
Well, that's what he was working on. George, you know, they accused him of being a marketeer or profiteer. George gave away most of his stuff for free. The photos he handed out to people and gave it to them. Most of the translation publications in which his books came out in dozens of countries were without royalties and without fees. George didn't make any money off of this. In fact, his only concern was to go forward, educate the public, and also educate the official agencies, because he felt that these are the people who govern our country, these are the people who have their finger on the nuclear button and what have you. They need to have accurate information in order to get and be able to obtain, verifiable information and to substantiate the decisions they have to make. So George was not a person who accused. He understands the government. He understood what motivated them and what made them uneasy. And he never went out there and slapped them in the face, which has become such a standard process these days, to point the finger at everybody and anybody. And
Very true.
It's really counterproductive. You get much further, as I have learned over the decades working with my father, who interacted with many official agencies, and I had the opportunity as well. I got many more invitations and much more equitable conversations, simply because I honored people's and respected their anonymity, and also the fact that it's not the name that's behind it that's what people are so after. Whether you're a PhD or a nuclear physicist or whatever, we're so enthralled with titles. That is irregardless. It is the validity of the information that you give. And George bought information that was going to help the evolution of mankind on this world. That was what he worked so diligently for.
Well, he was a philosopher.
Well,
I know that,
in some respects,
he started as a professor and a philosopher. And this is a question. My name is Linda, anyhow. I'm part of the show.
Nice to talk to you.
Nice to talk to you. I have a really great question. Will you tell us who is your father and how did he get involved with George, and who was the people that George hung around with, the witnesses and the people who did, Alice Wells and those people who saw the UFOs and did the sketches when they met Orthon, the alien and everything. Can you give a little background and how you got yourself involved too?
Sure. To do so quickly, basically my parents grew up during World War II in Europe, and there were a number of sightings then. And of course, the sightings in Europe go way, way back. Not only does photographic evidence go back until 1918, which precludes the Nazis by, a dozen and a half years. Also, the historical contents, paintings of these type of craft go back through the Middle Ages and thousands of years, as far back as biblical records. So the accusation that these type of crafts came from Nazi development is absolutely nonsense. What the Nazis did do was they copied some of the things they saw, and they tried to re-engineer it, and they were not very successful. But long story short, my parents had seen large cigar-shaped craft and saucer craft. My father was highly intently interested. His father, my grandfather, was a Luftwaffe pilot, and so he had an aviation background. And my father plotted on a world map with pins in those days, the little colored pins, UFO sightings all over the world through the time of the 40s and 50s, and they were hundreds, if not thousands, as much as 600 a day at one point. That's what the military released in Project Blue Book. And so when we came to this country and immigrated to the U.S., we had seen a number of craft in Colorado Springs area, and then eventually in downtown Washington, D.C. in March of 1963, we saw this bell-shaped craft, of which the pictures I uploaded into your website there, over downtown Washington at about 1,500 feet. And I think I even put the article there that was in the newspaper the next day, because there was a reporter for the Washington Daily News and about 30 other witnesses on the street. And so my father said, okay, let me go to a place where I can get factual information. That was the Library of Congress, and alphabetically under Adamski was Flying Saucers Have Landed, which was co-authored by Sir Desmond Leslie, and that is from the Leslie estate in Ireland, a well-known family and grandnephew of Winston Churchill. And inside were photographs of the same type of craft we had just witnessed and seen before. My father wrote to George, who was in Vista, California, where I now live, and George was coming to lecture to the Air Force Reserves in Washington, and he came 2 months later, and we became good friends. And eventually, the last 2 years of George's life, we were working with him as his personal co-workers and witnesses to many of the events that happened, and some of the films and some of the contacts. And so eventually when George passed away, that was bequeathed to my parents. And Alice Wells and Martha Aldrich and dozens of other these people whom I grew up with knew George all the way back to the late 20s. And so I can say that I have been firmly educated and with facts and manuscripts and evidence that is heavily substantial in George's favor. And we have been doing that ever since. The foundation was created in 1966, and we became full inheritors there towards the end of the 70s as Alice became more frail. Then she eventually handed over the whole reins to my father, and he then carried it forth until he passed away in 91. And then it seemed only logical for me to carry on the work, since I'm probably the last of the youngest remembrances of George and this work. And then, of course, I have the archives and evidence and everything like that. Like
you ever think of doing a museum?
So that's how much we pretty much came into this.
Well, one of the questions that I have for you goes back to when George was first contacted by Orthon in the desert. Now, he went ahead and he mentioned he took night after night of pictures, mainly astrophotography, and he was hoping to cite some UFO craft back then, and his patients eventually rewarded him. He eventually saw some craft, and then he went during the day to take some pictures, and of course his patients rewarded him with meeting Orthon. There seem to have been a number of craft sighted extensively in that decade, and people were coming forth and telling their stories. What I would like to know is, what was the criteria in actually becoming a contactee for these people who were flying this craft? Because obviously it takes a lot of trust and integrity in one person. So how would they have picked somebody and say, this is going to be the person who is going to bring our message forth?
Well, there's two aspects to that. First of all, the number of sightings, as you mentioned, were reported by, hundreds of witnesses, Southern California area, already going back to the 40s in the newspapers, and I supplied you with a couple of downloads of those newspaper articles as well. And so George wasn't the only contactee. There's a number of other ones. You have Reinhold Schmidt, you have Buck Nelson, you have Daniel Fry, Frank Scully. You've got a whole series of them. They were these are just the names that we know about. Other people, like the twin girls in Norway, the lady in South Africa, Father Gill, witness down there in Papua New Guinea. It covers every continent around the world. And so basically what has happened is that originally our government military were not highly briefed on what was going on. And so they initially threw a cap of secrecy on top of everything. And at one point they were almost willing to release it. George made a statement that in the early 50s they had printed up over 100 million flyers that they were going to disperse to the population to give them accurate, up-to-speed information. And the military stepped in, primarily Howard Vandenberg, Air Force Chief of Staff, and he was largely responsible for squashing the whole thing. And so basically these craft and these people who had made contact found out that our government officials and our religious officials, all of whom they contacted, were unwilling to let it trickle down to the general public. And so when the veil of secrecy and the cap of secrecy was slapped on it from the official side, they decided to land more amongst the population. Now, the so-called vetting process, I will say this. They watch extremely carefully and they study the individuals upon whom they come, and the legitimate contactees whom they come in contact with. Because there's so much more to this. They don't do anything haphazard. They consider a person's past, a person's history, their mental state, the effect of how this will affect them, how they will become ridiculed and ostracized from the general public and the scientific community and harassed by military intelligence and so on and so forth during those years. And so while there may be a grand upside, there's also a very grand downside.
Right.
Because you get exposed to technology and people who have learned to live peaceably amongst themselves. They don't have any biases and discrimination between male and female and color and gender and everything else that we have managed to fractionalize our population so that we can abuse each and every one of these factions. They don't live under those circumstances. And so basically they're several thousand years ahead of us, both science-wise and sociologically. And so imagine that you are taken into that presence, and then when that's done, you have to come back here and deal with all the bull that is going on here. It's very hard, and George described it many times as having to live in two worlds.
That must have been very hard for him. I mean, it couldn't have been easy. And also, what I was wondering when you were saying that that the message that the military was trying to, or government officials were trying to squash the message that they were giving, or what do you think was the resistance?
Well, as I mentioned in the new release of the book there, Behind the Flying Saucer Mystery 2, there are several denominations of representation. One, we have a certain amount of people who are, whether they're government, whether they're scientists, whether they're military people, and you can mention them whether they happen to be Secretary Forrestal, General Twining, many different people during these areas that all believe that this was highly important information and that should be given to the people. And you have another faction that said, no, the people can't handle that, or shall we say, we can't control the masses if we give them too much information, and so you have that faction fighting the other one, or subverting it is the better answer. And then you have the third faction, and that is the ones that wish to mislead, abuse, and misinform and twist the entire agenda to put this whole thing to look so ridiculous and ridicule factor and skeptic factor that it basically turns it into a witch's brew of confusion. And so you have that, and you add it to the mix of the people and the many personalities that float around in this field, and then you've got yourself a very difficult scenario. We no longer, in the UFO field or exobiology and these things, there's very little education of the masses, true education, whether it happens to be science or it happens to be factual information to give them an understanding of how things work in the cosmos. What we're really doing is throwing around accusations and each one beating their own drum in their own chest and each one pointing fingers at each other. And so all this does is tend to make this whole subject even dumbed down further than it is already. So they're doing no service other than a disservice to themselves and everybody else.
Glenn, we're going to go ahead and take a break. I want you to hold that thought, and we'll be right with you. We will continue this conversation as soon as we come back on the air.
Okay.
Okay, Glenn, you still there?
Yes, sir.
Awesome. Let's continue on.
So we left off by asking why certain government officials and why the military was resistant to the message. And I wasn't I know that you were busy answering, but is there any more you'd like to say about that?
Yes, I mean, it's been talked about before, but you have to understand that we have a very micromanaged society and level of advancement and progress. So things are very carefully scripted here, and progress is measured in millimeters, and the word freedom is used, in everything but what it actually means. And so we don't want too much change too soon. So if you talk about extraterrestrial visitors and coming with electromagnetic spacecraft, or what we term as free energy, this represents a very huge economic shift for us because, to a certain extent, we totally rely on the consumption of petroleum products and its byproducts, and then to the equal amount, we have developed an economy based upon the manufacturing and distributing of arms and weapons around the world. We are the number one arms supplier in the world. And we wonder why there's no peace, because we sell everybody guns, and then we tell them, oh, no, you can't use them, and obviously that's not going to happen.
And then
so
govern each other about
it.
Yeah.
So when you look at this alone, from the standpoint of energy consumption, this is a dramatic shift away from our economy and our market system. Then, of course, you have the other aspect of it. The religious bodies are defending their territory and turf like a pack of dogs, each one hoping for greater influence and greater population numbers in order to sustain their belief system. And when you open up the idea and travel of space and the introduction and interaction with more life and more intelligence, both greater intelligence and lesser intelligence, because we're merely one classroom in the whole cosmos of life, then this changes how things are done on this world, and we fight that with everything we have.
Yep, that's true.
Now, let's go back to the beginning when George actually had his first sighting, and he was one of the few people to have actually met somebody from another world, who he claimed was from Venus. Let's go back to that meeting with Orthon. Orthon and him tried to communicate, but obviously Orthon's language sounded a little bit different than our language, and they were partly talking telepathically because George was very good at being able to read people's thoughts. Did George ever describe what was Orthon's reaction in meeting him? We always hear about how George felt when he met Orthon. He was very excited, obviously, and I believe Alice was sketching a picture of him as they were meeting. But did he ever describe what Orthon was feeling, what he was thinking when he first came across him?
Well, yes. Once again, they look at the entire situation and the type of individual they're contacting, and so for them, they are well versed and well educated into this individual, because it's very simple. Reading of people's thoughts is an everyday occurrence for them. They do not have secrets like we do, and so they are very open and very purposeful people, and so they are as much attuned to you as you are to yourself. In fact, they probably know you better than you know yourself. And so the first communication was, like I mentioned, in the desert sand there, by smoothing it out and drawing the solar system, pointing to the planets. Also, the transference of picture thought. Telepathy is a picture language. It is not a physical written language. Because if I write to you, if I would send to you the words dog in Chinese and you don't understand Chinese, it means nothing. Telepathy works on pictures. You send the picture of the item that you wish to transfer, and you broadcast it like a radio station, and the receptive component on the end picks it up. So if I want to get in contact with you, I picture your face, I picture the telephone, and if you're receptive, you think, gee, I have this intuition to call Glenn, I call Glenn, and Glenn says, yeah, I've been sending you the thought. It works like that. Nature uses it all the time. Your cats, your animals, your dogs, all of nature, the trees, the plants, that all uses telepathy as a picture language. And in fact, when my parents went to NASA, the 22 scientists at Goddard in '67, that was one of their highest priorities, the effective use of telepathy as a backup communication system for the space program, in case telecommunications were fried. They could still communicate with the astronauts. And the astronauts also mentioned that when in space and they were clear of the atmosphere of the Earth, the so-called congestiveness, then they were able to communicate much more open. They could almost read each other's thoughts. And so telepathy works quite well. And in fact, it was George wrote a 3-part series, Telepathy Part 1, 2, and 3, which we make available to the public, and that was used by a major university in this country when it was teaching on a course on that.
I read
so
part of that.
telepathy is used by the rest of the cosmos to a great extent, and we are capable of it. We're just not trained at it. And if if we would be exposed and trained to it at a young age, like we do everything else. We want our children to become golfers and millionaires, so we train them at the age of 3 or 4 to swing a club. And these sort of things, if we would teach them more productive things like to understand themselves and communicate telepathically and to be able to raise their frequency and levitate, all these things are within your capability, and we just simply don't teach it. And so if you don't teach it, you don't believe in it, you're not doing it. And so this is the type of interaction that George had with this fellow called Orthon, and he met many of these space people, and he gave them symbolic names. These were not their actual names.
Not their
These
real
symbolic
names, yeah.
names were based on historical accounts and things like that. The next time he met Orthon, which was about 4 or 5 months later, in the desert out by Palmdale, then this gentleman spoke very good English, and George asked him, how is that possible? And they said, we have a teaching system that is based very much on phonics or music, because it's interesting that if you memorize the words to a song based upon the harmonics, you remember that 40, 50 years later. You can't understand why, but you just managed to. It's easier learned that way, and their language system is more very much like music. And so they are capable of learning languages in months and becoming fluent. And so the people he interacted with thereafter spoke our language very well.
Now, I noticed that most of the first communication he did with Orthon was based a lot on visualization and pictures, and he even tried to ask Orthon about religion. I noticed George was spreading his arms around saying, do you believe in God? Do you believe in a being, a deity, a being who encompasses all of life? And George was spreading it, and then Orthon was listening to him, and he was a little bit puzzled at first, and then he finally got what he was saying, and he was trying to describe what they think of deity or religion in their own language, in their own concept. And it was it was different than ours, but it was they look at it a little bit differently in that system.
That's correct. In other words, also in the book Behind the Flying Saucer Mystery, which was the first, was basically, it's a republishing of Flying Saucers Farewell, which is George's third book. And in there's a chapter which is called What I've Learned from the Interplanetarians, and it describes their life on their planets and how they live and what they believe and their educational system and so on and so forth. It's very clear and very simple. But from the standpoint of deity, they do not personalize it. We personalize everything. We believe that that God is just there for us, and it will read our thoughts, and will take care of us. And
So
it
true.
always comes back to a personalization, where they have learned through millions of years of traveling the cosmos and studying life's principles, that they have learned that the creative force, or the deity, or the creator, or whatever you want to call that name, is an impersonal intelligence that manifests itself through the entire cosmos and is responsible for the creation of that. And while we argue, I had an interesting conversation not long ago, it's an argumentation of, oh boy, when I was asked, well, did the Big Bang happen 12 billion years ago, or is it 13 or 14 or 15? I said, first of all, does it matter? And secondly, we're talking semantics here. It's ridiculous. And then on top of it, they have shown that no matter how far they travel and for how many millions of years, that there is no end to the cosmos. And this is a concept we have a very hard time grasping here, that there is no beginning and no end. And their mathematics does not work with the numeric zero. Zero is nothing. It means nothing to them. For them, 1 and 1 equals 3, because 1 positive and 1 negative come together and produces the third. And so that's how their mathematics continues to function. And that's also described in that book as well. And many studies have been done on that mathematics, and they find that the spacecraft are built to the tune of those mathematics, where, for instance, the small scout craft is 33 feet in diameter. Some people say, well, when is that 32, 34, 35, blah, blah, blah. It has to do with that type of universal mathematics. So while we broadcast into space, supposedly with the SETI system, the formula for pi, and, somebody picks it up, pi for them, well, that's lemon meringue, coconut cream, whatever. It doesn't mean anything to to the rest of the cosmos, because their numeric system is not based upon our decimal system that we have configured from cuneiform script and then evolved through the Julian time and the Roman time and the Greek and everything else. That's something we've invented here in this world. And once we travel beyond this world, we'll finally start to awaken to things, how they actually work. Well, now we are just assuming and theorizing and postulating. Enough of this nonsense. It's better to find out for the fact what it is.
And at the same time, when he was on the craft in one of the later meetings, they had somebody who was, they had their own philosophy and their own teachings and their own belief system, because they had somebody who was considered a master, and this person wanted to have a long, in-depth talk with him about our people, our destiny, and where we were going, and how we would be interacting with them in the future.
Yes,
the chapter
that's
meeting
true.
with the master.
In the book Inside the Spaceships, he describes that meeting with the master as the name of the chapter, although George said in their societies there's no such thing as master, because that would create an ascendancy above everybody else. There's just people who are greater in the act of learning, and some that have yet to acquire it. We're all in the classroom and schoolroom of life. But he used those terms so, in effect, that we could understand. But when you read it, it also talks about universal principle, and many of the universal principles that have been taught on this world, whether it happens to be by Chidney, Confucius, Buddha, Jesus, and a number of others, the core essential is always the same. You look at the first 6, 7, 8 principles, they're always the same. Love one another, but that's the principle of love, not the emotion of love. We don't understand what love means. We make it very, once again, personal. And then the reverence for life, all of life, from the smallest to the highest. And so you go on and you look at that. So these principles have all been taught over the millennium on this world. We just give it lip service. We just say, well, thou shalt not kill unless I want revenge or so-called justice, or I'm just pissed off, or whatever. So we don't follow these principles where they live it under all circumstances. And they have, in fact, on several occasions, given up their lives, but not to retaliate and hurt us, because they see us as younger, shall we say, students and inexperienced students, and they would never do that to us. So they have great compassion and great understanding, much more than we are willing to invest in our own selves.
Well, we have a bigger ego, too.
Well, that's basically what we all
you know, as a human race, we have a bigger ego, and that makes us...
Well, let's revise that statement for a minute and say, as the representative of how things are on this planet, we live by ego, 95%. We have this intuition, or our soul or consciousness, which speaks to us in the whisper voice, and we constantly push it aside and say, don't bother me because I want this, give me that, satiate me this, stroke me this way, blah, 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 blah. That's happening everywhere. Politics, academics, everywhere, even in our own private lives. And while we live under this principle, we will continue to degrade, because the me, me, me principle means I got to have more for me, and since there's only a finite amount, I got to take it from you. And that's why our society is slumping faster and faster into the abyss.
Yeah, we seem to be going backwards a lot faster
more backwards
lately.
these days.
We're evolving backwards.
Yeah, definitely.
I have a question with Orthon. What was his message, or what was he trying to help George to get through our race?
The understanding of who and what we are. Part of that has to do with our own inner character. In other words, we are always looking to learn more, to strive more, and we have recently, and I'm saying recently, over a certain amount of millennia, have translated more into be more acquisitions and more products and more, self-fulfillment, and instead of more expansion, more understanding, more wisdom, more intellect, and that doesn't mean education. Intelligence, the expression of the divine intelligence that is given each and every one of us. As Jesus said, I'm the Father and the Father's me, and that's the same thing as all the other people. We each carry the spark of the divine Creator within us. That's what gives us life. The body upon which we live is nothing more than a shell, like your apartment or home. Eventually you leave it, and you go to the next one, so that you can express yourself. And this happens over and over again because it's impossible to learn everything you have to learn in one single solitary lifetime. It takes many millions of them. And so they brought this in order to help us understand. And space is our next logical progression. Because if we go to space successfully, like President Kennedy pushed so hard, and George had interaction with Kennedy, George had interaction with President Eisenhower. He took him to one of the air bases with one of the craft land. He introduced him to him. He did the same for Kennedy. And so when we push ourselves into that expansion, we find that we cooperate with each other. When you talk to the astronauts in space, they don't care if one Soviet, one Chinese, one American. All of that means nothing. You have to depend on each other completely. You put your life into their hands and vice versa.
Most definitely.
And that freedom, that true freedom, we are scared like nobody's business of on this planet. And so if we go out into space, we take the next logical step, not only in learning and progression, but in science as well. And that includes also the expansion on this planet, whether it's oceanography, geology, the earth, the natural sciences, where you learn from nature, because everything is in front of you. There are no mysteries. There's only your recognition of it. And if you don't recognize it, you mystify it. But once you learn about it, it's no longer a mystery. You say, aha, that's how that works. You understand, you grow, you progress, and then you move on to the next thing. This constant mystification of everything is nothing more than another mind suppressant in order to stir this whole thing up again.
I believe that. Now, what I'd like to also find out about that first meeting, when Orthon left his footprints on the sand that had the writing that came from the soles of his shoes, that had that different writing, those symbols, has anybody seriously tried to take those symbols and decode them since
More
then?
than just seriously. So to give your listeners a very brief history, Mr. Bailey, who was one of the witnesses, was an amateur anthropologist. He lived in the Southwest. He made a lot of plaster casts. He studied Indian carvings and what have you. So he had a small contingent of these type of items in the back of his pickup station wagon, rather. So the visitor left in the impression on the bottom of their soles is a series of symbols. Not any different than if you buy a high-end tennis shoe today and you look at the sole of it, you've got all different kind of tread marks, all kinds of different designs that are raised and things like that. It's the same principle. In this case, the shoes is part of the pilot's standard wear. So, for instance, inside the craft, and this is a very old craft, this is their Model T, there is a large control panel that looks like a Hammond organ, and it has keys to it. And just like they have keys, it also has pedals. But in this case, when you step on the pedals, certain indentations from the sole help activate certain instrumentation. So that's why the pilot of this craft carried these type of indentations in the sole. They made two sets of plaster casts of this. One set of plaster cast went to Sir Desmond Leslie, and part of that still resides in their exhibit in Castle Leslie in Ireland. And the other one George kept, and over the years, unfortunately, got destroyed due to a fire at the foundation in the late 60s and what have you. But
I heard about
I
that.
will be going
That's
out to
sad.
Castle Leslie here in a few months, and so we'll see what goes from there. But anyway, so those symbols, along with the symbols that I sent you on the upload of the photographic plate with the disc and the numeric symbols on it, were the information in order to decipher a free energy device. And Professor Marcel Humet, 10 years after Adamski had got those symbols, found those same symbols carved in the Brazilian jungle. And he photographed those, and he made statements that he'd never found Adamski to be untruthful. And when you look at the symbols, you see that they're about 80% the same.
Right, I was
So it
looking
goes
at that.
to show you that ancient societies were visited and given the same information as well. A fellow by the name of Basil Vandenberg in South Africa took those sets of symbols, the footprints, the other two sets, constructed a working free energy model, wrote an article, says, my discoveries will prove Adamski's claim. And he called an international press conference, and he was going to go there. George counseled him and said, listen, you have to be careful of how you advertise and use this information because there are many people who will take it from you. Basil got on an airplane to Europe, I believe Switzerland, to change airplanes, and he disappeared and was never seen from again.
Wow.
Yikes.
But
Yikes.
another set of decipherings in the book called The Case for Adamski, published in French, an orthopedic surgeon went through the footprints and did a very intense analysis of that and found them to be exactly what you would expect of a person about 5'7" and that same weight structure as Orthon was described. And so they were actively been deciphered and looked at. And so, once again, that's another notch in the favor of that information.
Fascinating.
Now, we're going to be taking a station break, and hold that thought. I want to go ahead and ask you some more questions about when he was actually in the ship and with the crew, and some questions about the technology and what he witnessed there.
Okay.
All right, and we are back. Glenn, are you there?
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay, I have an interesting question, just because it kind of ties to contemporary and the same subject. Did George ever... I'm just thinking about the concept of, let's say, grays, reptilians, the things that people report nowadays. Were any of those reports going on at that time? Was he aware of any of that?
No. If you look historically for thousands of years, and you look at the records in the many different civilizations, there was always the description of human beings, people with greater intelligence and greater benevolence, that would come upon the societies. Native Americans have many of these descriptions, so does all the societies from the Aztecs to the Incas to the Polynesians to the Tibetanians all over the world. And so there was a discussion, I had this discussion as well with several scientists, and over the many decades of research, the conclusion was that there are four types. There are humans, there are humanoids, there's robotics, and there's androids. And if you look at the book, Hollywood versus the Flying Saucer, which is an excellent book describing the media's and the military's influence into the media and movie industry, and Silver Screen Saucers is another one. I recommend those both highly to any of your listeners. You can find them online, of course. It discusses these same things, these same ideas as well. When you look at the organic chemistry and the biological principles, you find how quickly the commonality of life is. And as it was stated just a week ago on the television, on watching one of these shows, it's not the astronomers that are going to explain life in the cosmos, it's the biochemists, which is true, because the amino acids, the RNA and DNA, all the essential minerals and elements come from space around us. In fact, it rains down on this planet to the tune of several tons per day. And it happens to all the other planets as well. We mix with Martian material, Martians mix with us, so on and so forth. It spreads throughout the cosmos. That's why you can go to the Antarctic and find a meteorite that comes from Mars, where you figure, how would it get there? It's because we intercept that as we travel through space. The commonality of these elements mean the commonality of the development of life. And through the travel through space, we find that the human genome is the norm rather than the exception. Now, have people perhaps witnessed robotics or androids? Well, that's a great possibility because these crafts carry both as well. But when you come to the point of exobiology, if you look at the work of Dr. Panampura, University of Maryland biochemistry, in his book Principles of Life, it describes it very, very simply and succinctly. And he also described why people always complain, well, why is it all carbon-based and not silicone-based or what have you? Mm-hmm. And that's sheer ignorance on our part, because any biochemist will tell you that silicone molecules don't bond, and they're also water-soluble. So consequently, you're not going to get the development of the elements that way. There is a huge contingent of misinformation in this field. There is an even larger contingent of supposition, and even a larger condition of imagination.
Yeah.
And so I prefer to work in circles that are a little bit more reality and fact-based. And fortunately, I've had that exposure all my life. And I think that this message has to come to the people as much as I can possibly do, because very little of it is being promoted by any of the other personalities in this field.
Right.
Now, we want to discuss what some of the present day questions are in continuing the work. But back to the past, when George was actually in touch with the crew, he was describing Now, you kind of answered my question already about when he was describing some of their culture and some of what some of their diet was when they were actually having that farewell feast when he was actually on that ship with them. I was thinking, well, how did they know that some of this was safe for him to eat? Some of this was safe for him to have? Because whenever I hear about something falling to earth, like a rock or a mineral, they always caution to be careful because of the bacteria on it. So I was wondering, well, how did they know that some of what he ingested or some of what he was experiencing was going to be safe for him on that craft?
Well, let's answer that twofold. One, if you don't want the public to interact or collect anything, what do? You scare them first. And
right.
You say, my God, if something comes there, don't touch it, don't go near it. If it's alien, then it's going to pop out at you like Star Wars or the movie Alien or any of these other fanciful notions that are going around. So we're all worried like crazy that we're going to be propagated by all these different bacteria and chemicals and compounds, because once again, it's our ignorance of what is going on in space and what composes the other planets very much like composes here. And secondly, they are human beings like you and I.
Right.
There's no difference in the development of the body, the location of the organs. It's we are a common template, and so they are believing in giving nutrients to their form that is a requirement. That they give the form what it needs, and we give our form what we want, and they're entirely two different things. And so, do they eat meat? They eat some in a limited amount. Have they developed some high protein fundamentals? Absolutely, because they understand that there are 8 amino acids in proteins, and we can synthesize 7, but we can't do the 8th. So they give the body what it needs, and they're not discriminatory upon that. And so are they very, shall we say, sympathetic? If they need to harvest animal meat, then they do so in a limited quantity amounts, and they do it with a ray that puts the animal to sleep. They don't have the same kind of butcher techniques we have.
Same kind of slaughter methods, yeah.
They don't have a slaughter methods, but they're not unrealistic too. They understand that they are created, RNA and DNA. They have requirements and cell requirements of the body that need to be fulfilled, and they do not discriminate against it. Here we do things simply because, we don't like that. We're emotional about this, emotional about that. As George said, well, if you knew that the plants you ate had intelligence too, then you would be saying, well, I can't eat the meat, I can't eat the fish, I can't eat the plants.
Yeah,
I starve to death.
Definitely.
Because from the standpoint of creation, there isn't anything that doesn't have intelligence.
Yeah.
I have a little question. Go ahead, Verna.
No, go ahead. Linda can answer that first.
I'm just a little curious. Where Orthon and those guys were from Venus, and where we see Venus looks like a very fire planet. How in the world I mean, how do they get through the flames and everything? And do they have is the flames just kind of like a force field? And maybe if they go in the flames, maybe it's more like a Earth-like planet, or they live underground, or
And I heard it used to be kind of a greenhouse atmosphere before it became.
Yeah, I mean, how is that possible?
Okay, threefold. One, I want you to go online and look at a Mariner 10 picture of Venus. I came across this through my research. In fact, I'll download it and send it to you.
Right on.
It is almost
Great.
comparable to Earth. White clouds, blue underneath, and that's a flyby picture, the only one I've ever seen of its kind. The rest of the pictures we see are completely of a standardized form. Why is that? Secondly, if I ask the people, do you believe what your government tells you and what your military tells you? And unfortunately, NASA is one of those agencies that's run by military and government. So do you believe what they're telling you is true? And they're saying, oh, hell no.
Well,
So
no,
let us look at the dichotomy of information. We told everybody the moon is a dead place. Well, we've proven there's water geysers, atmosphere, clouds, mists, moving lights. These are NASA publications, not just mine. And, of course, those are put in my father's book, Alien Bases on the Moon. You can see them for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Pioneering. He pioneered in that particular research. Everybody else copied him thereafter. But anyway, so we found a commonality of the so-called elements and aspects of life that we so tout already on the moon. Now we move to Mars. And we showed everybody pictures of a red planet with a red sky. And then recently we see pictures with a beautiful blue sky, but just a few of them. And everybody said, wow, why is there such a difference? Because we're not always getting the same information. You look at Petrie and Molinar, who were the original NASA engineers who uncovered the face on Mars pictures. They caused Viking to go away from the plain of Cydonia and land in a totally different spot when those pictures were released. And then you look at Crowley, who put the book out, Face on Mars. My father did extensive talks with him in Australia in '85 when he lectured there, both of them. Crowley said, I not only have evidence of past civilizations and monuments, but recent ones at the same time. And then we see that Mars now has water. Salt water recently was revealed. Funny thing is, in 1963, George Adamski wrote in his Science of Life course, Mars has a plethora of salt water. Well, how in the world would he know that 40, 50 years earlier? So we, piece by piece, slowly give out the information and kind of ease people to it. Look at Venus. They claim it's 6 times denser than boiling oil at a temperature of 800 degrees, 400-mile-an-hour winds, and then they tell you we successfully land probes with a parachute. Now I ask you logically, explain that.
Right.
Then they show you pictures, radar pictures, of very jagged mountains. If you sandblast something at 800 degrees at 400 miles an hour, how long do you think it's going to be before the surface of that planet is as smooth as a marble? Now there's more talk. Recently, just a couple of weeks ago, well, Venus was very much like Earth. It used to always be labeled a sister planet, and there are talk as well that they believe they find some structures, and so on and so forth. So what we're doing here is we're systematically trying to stretch as much as possible the acknowledgement of life in the solar system. And we're trying to take people and push them out into deep space. 2 reasons. 1, we denied UFOs and flying saucers for so long and swept it under the rug. You now cannot go out into space and admit, hey, there's life out there, because everybody's going to say, well, that life came to visit it, and you guys are a bunch of lying dirtbags. So one lie has to be supported by the secondary one, as I explained in the book, Behind the Flying Saucer Mystery. Second, right? And so we have those 2. Then we have slowly admitting to the people how things are in the solar system, but we'll stretch it out 100 years if we can and refocus everybody else's attention into deep space and say, oh, well, in these light years away, there may be some life and Earth planets there, but it's so far away. And the general public says, oh, well, that doesn't affect me, that might be 1,000 years from now, blah, 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 blah. It is a contrived method of desensitizing and separating people's interest.
Glenn, I think we're going to be coming. The show is going to be coming to an end in a few minutes. Actually, coming to an end now. I have so much more questions for you. We'd love to have you back, and and there's so much more I want to discuss on these subjects. Will you come back to the show one of these times?
I will come back as many times as you wish. Just
That would be
email me
wonderful.
when we have some
Great.
respective dates, and we will talk up a storm.
Excellent.
Please do.
Excellent.
Yes, that would be great. I would just.
It's been
you're
great
so
having you.
fascinating, and it's just like I can listen to you all night.
So
long.
could I.
Yep.
Well, I thank you. Appreciate it. I have been very fortunate to have a long history of these sightings and even meeting some of George's contacts, so I feel very honored in that, and I feel it's my responsibility to pass as much along as I can.
If you're ever in San Francisco, please stop in the studio. We'd love to take you out to dinner.
Absolutely.
Very good. I come through often.
Cool.
Great.
Thanks a lot, Glenn, and have a great night, and we look forward to talking to you again.
Yeah,
Very
thank you
good.
Thank you,
so
Glenn.
much. You
Having me.
are fantastic.
Yeah, it was wonderful.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Portal.